The phone call came on a Sunday afternoon. My mother's voice had that careful tone she used when delivering news she knew I wouldn't want to hear. Said that Aunt Margaret was coming to visit for a week, would be staying at my apartment if that was all right, wanted to spend time with me since we hadn't seen each other in years. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now to stay updated on your phone. I hesitated before agreeing. Aunt Margaret had strong opinions about everything, particularly about career choices and life paths. She'd been vocal about my decision to pursue aviation, had made her disapproval clear at every family gathering I'd attended during flight school. But she was family, and my mother had already told her the visit was arranged. Margaret arrived on a Tuesday evening. I picked her up from the airport, helped her with her luggage, drove her back to my apartment in comfortable silence. She looked older than I remembered, more gray in her hair, deeper lines around her eyes. But her bearing was the same, that confident certainty about how the world worked and what choices were sensible. At dinner that first night, she asked about my job. Not with genuine curiosity, but with the tone of someone confirming suspicions. Asked if I was still working for the airline, if I'd given up on the pilot dream yet, if I'd started considering more practical career options. I told her I was still flying, that I'd been with the airline for 9 years now, that the career was going well. She made a small sound of acknowledgement, something between disappointment and resignation. Said she'd hoped I would have moved on by now, that surely I'd realized aviation wasn't realistic for someone like me. Asked what she meant by someone like me. She was direct in response, said that commercial aviation was an industry with limited opportunities, that breaking in was difficult, that sustaining a career was even harder, that she'd known from the beginning this was a fantasy, a dream that would eventually hit reality and force me toward more practical work. I told her I'd been flying commercially for 9 years, that I had a permanent position, that reality had actually been quite accommodating to the fantasy. She waved this away, said that lower-level positions were one thing, but that real aviation careers, the kind with advancement and stability, were different, that I should be thinking about transition plans. The conversation was exhausting. Every response I gave was met with skepticism or dismissal, every achievement reframed as temporary or insufficient. By the time we finished eating, I was ready for the visit to end, and she'd only been there a few hours. Over the next few days, Margaret settled into my apartment and my routine. She was polite about the space, careful not to intrude, but her presence made everything feel evaluated, like she was gathering evidence to support conclusions she'd already reached about my life choices. I had a trip scheduled that week, 3-day sequence, flying out Thursday and returning Saturday. Mentioned it to Margaret on Wednesday, explained I'd be gone but that she should make herself at home, help herself to anything in the kitchen, use the spare keys if she wanted to explore the city. She asked what kind of trip, what routes I'd be flying. I explained it was a pairing to Tokyo with a layover, then back to Portland. She looked skeptical, asked if I was serious or joking. When I confirmed it was serious, she asked what my actual role was, whether I was working as crew or in some support capacity. Told her I was flying it, that I was the captain, that this was a regular part of my schedule. She laughed. Not meanly, but dismissively, like I'd said something absurd that she was humoring. Said I didn't need to exaggerate, that whatever work I was doing was fine, that she wasn't judging my position. I pulled out my ID badge and showed her. Captain designation clearly printed, my photo, my employee number. She examined it carefully, her expression shifting from amused to confused. Asked if this was real or some kind of promotional material. I assured her it was my actual credential, that I actually was a captain, that I actually did fly internationally. She set the badge down and looked at me with something like concern. Said she didn't understand how this was possible, that she'd been certain I was working ground operations or maybe as cabin crew, that she'd assumed my vague mentions of flying were exaggerations or face-saving descriptions of more basic work. Explained that I'd never been vague, that I'd always been direct about being a pilot, that she'd apparently never believed me or had never listened carefully, that the fantasy she thought I was chasing had actually been reality for almost a decade, while she'd been assuming I'd failed and was too embarrassed to admit it. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that commercial pilots were mostly men, that she'd never heard of women flying wide-body international routes, that this seemed highly unusual. I told her it was less common but not unusual, that women had been flying commercially for decades, that I was one of many. She asked why I'd never corrected her assumptions at family gatherings, why I'd let her believe I was working some lesser position. I pointed out that I'd tried to explain multiple times that she'd dismissed or reinterpreted everything I'd said, that eventually I'd stopped trying to convince her of reality she was determined not to see. The conversation ended awkwardly. Margaret retreated to the guest room and I finished preparing for my trip. packed my flight bag, reviewed the weather for the Pacific crossing, checked my schedule one more time. The routine was comforting, familiar, separate from the tension in my apartment. Thursday morning, I left early while Margaret was still asleep. Left a note saying I'd be back Saturday evening, reminding her about the spare keys and making herself comfortable. Drove to the airport in pre-dawn darkness, grateful for the temporary escape from her presence and her judgments. The operations briefing was routine. Weather patterns over the Pacific, routing options, fuel planning for the long overwater segment. My first officer for the trip was someone I'd flown with several times, professional and easy to work with. We coordinated efficiently. Both of us experienced enough that communication was minimal and effective. The aircraft was a 777, one of the larger wide bodies, configured for long international flights. I walked the exterior in the cool Portland morning, checking everything systematically, the familiar inspection routine that started every flight. Everything looked good, maintenance had signed off on all items, the aircraft was ready. Back in the cockpit, we ran through the pre-flight checklist: battery switches, hydraulic systems, flight controls, navigation programming, the mechanical precision of preparation, the structured routine that never changed regardless of what was happening in the rest of life. This part made sense, this part was reliable. Boarding completed smoothly. Full flight. Mostly business travelers and tourists heading to Japan. None of them knew or cared about my family dynamics, about my aunt's assumptions and dismissals, about the gap between her perception and my reality. They just trusted that qualified pilots would fly them safely across the Pacific. Made my announcement welcoming everyone aboard, giving them the flight time and weather information. My voice sounded calm and professional through the PA system, the practiced skill of projecting competence regardless of underlying stress or frustration. We pushed back on time. I started the engines, felt them spool up, ran through the after-start checklist with my first officer. Tower cleared us to taxi, and I steered toward the runway, the aircraft responding smoothly to my inputs. The work itself was pure, untainted by doubt or judgment, just procedures and physics. Taking off felt like relief. The acceleration, the rotation, the wheels leaving the ground. Portland falling away below as we climbed. The Pacific ahead. 13 hours of flying where nothing mattered except operating the aircraft safely and professionally. Up here, my aunt's opinions were irrelevant, her assumptions meaningless. The flight was smooth. Good weather over the ocean. Light traffic. Just steady cruise at 41,000 feet. My first officer and I took turns on break, the long-haul routine of managing rest and alertness over an extended flight. When I was flying, I monitored systems and weather. When I was resting, I tried not to think about the conversation waiting at home. Tokyo Approach began coordinating with us about 90 minutes out. The controller's professional English, the vectors and altitude assignments, the integration into the arrival flow. I flew the approach manually, wanted the engagement, the direct connection to the aircraft during the complex arrival into Narita. The landing was smooth, touched down gently on the runway, deployed thrust reversers, began braking. Another successful Pacific crossing, another proof of capability that my aunt apparently hadn't believed existed. Taxied to the international terminal and completed the shutdown checklist. The layover hotel was near the airport. I checked in and went straight to my room, exhausted from the flight and the time zone shift. Tried to sleep but kept replaying conversations with Margaret, her certainty that I was chasing fantasy, her surprise at the reality of my actual career. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now to stay updated on your phone. The return flight the next day was equally smooth. Different passengers but same professional operation, same long cruise over the Pacific, same routine arrival back in Portland. We landed Saturday evening right on schedule, and I drove home wondering what kind of reception would be waiting. Margaret was in the living room when I arrived. She looked up from her book as I came in, and her expression was difficult to read. Something between embarrassment and defensiveness, acknowledgement that she'd been wrong mixed with resistance to fully admitting it. I set down my flight bag and she asked how the trip had been. Told her it was routine, smooth flying, no issues. She nodded and said she'd been thinking about our conversation, about the assumptions she'd made, about how wrong they'd apparently been. Said apparently like there was still some room for doubt, like perhaps the reality I demonstrated was somehow less real than her assumptions. I didn't challenge it, just waited to see what else she'd say. Margaret explained that she'd spent the last 2 days researching, looking up information about women in aviation, reading about pilot careers and requirements, that she'd been surprised by what she'd found, that the industry was more diverse than she'd realized, that her assumptions had been based on outdated information. I told her those assumptions had been based on not listening to me when I'd explained my actual work, that I'd been direct about my career from the beginning, that she'd chosen to reinterpret everything through her preconceptions rather than accepting what I was actually telling her. She looked uncomfortable but didn't quite apologize. Said that it had seemed so unlikely, so far from what she understood to be possible, that she'd naturally assumed I was exaggerating or describing things more favorably than they were. That skepticism had felt reasonable given how unusual this career path was. Asked why women having this career was unusual to her when men having it was unremarkable. She didn't have a good answer, just repeated that she'd never personally known any female pilots, that it hadn't been part of her understanding of how the world worked, that her assumptions had reflected her limited exposure, not any judgment about capability. The conversation was circular and frustrating. Margaret couldn't quite admit she'd been wrong in any fundamental way, could only acknowledge that her information had been incomplete, that the fantasy she'd accused me of chasing had turned out to be real, but that her skepticism had been understandable given her limited knowledge. Sunday morning, Margaret mentioned she'd like to see the airport before leaving, that she'd never spent much time in terminals beyond necessary travel, asked if I'd show her around, maybe explain more about how the operations worked. The request felt like olive branch, an attempt to engage with reality instead of dismissing it. We drove to the airport that afternoon. I took her through the main terminal, showed her the departure boards with hundreds of flights to destinations worldwide, pointed out the airline I worked for, the long list of international routes, the constant flow of departures and arrivals. Margaret stood looking at the board for a long time, scanning the destinations, the times, the flight numbers. Then she pointed to a Tokyo departure listed for that evening and asked if I flew routes like that one. I confirmed that yes, I'd just returned from that exact route yesterday, that it was part of my regular rotation. She looked at the board, then at me, then back at the board, seemed to be processing the visual evidence, the concrete display of operations that matched what I'd been describing. The departure board didn't lie or exaggerate, just listed facts about flights that were actually happening. We walked through the concourse, and I showed her the gates for international flights, the larger aircraft parked at wide-body positions, the crews moving through the terminal, pointed out other pilots I recognized, mentioned their routes and aircraft types, showed her the ordinary reality of an industry she'd thought was fantasy. At one point, we passed a group of pilots heading toward their gate, 3 men and a woman, all in uniform, discussing their flight plan. Margaret watched them pass, and I could see her connecting what she was seeing to what I'd been telling her for years. The visual confirmation that female pilots existed and operated regularly. She asked if I knew the female pilot who'd just passed. I said yes, that we'd gone through training together years ago, that she was now a captain on European routes. Margaret asked how common that was. Female captains flying international. I said less common than male captains, but not rare, not remarkable, just normal part of operations. We found a coffee shop in the terminal and sat down. Margaret was quieter now, seemed to be processing everything she'd seen. Finally, she said that she owed me an apology, that she'd been wrong to dismiss my career, that she'd let her assumptions override what I'd been directly telling her. I acknowledged the apology but pointed out that the damage of not being believed had accumulated over years, that every family gathering where she'd implied I was chasing fantasy, every conversation where she'd suggested I consider practical alternatives, every dismissal of my actual achievements had taken a toll. She looked pained, but nodded, said she understood, that she couldn't undo those years of skepticism, that she'd have to work to rebuild credibility, that seeing the departure board had finally made real what I'd been describing, had broken through assumptions she hadn't even realized she was making. Asked why the departure board had been more convincing than my direct statements about my work. She admitted it was because the board was objective, impersonal, not subject to interpretation, that my statements she'd filtered through assumptions, but the board just displayed facts that couldn't be reinterpreted. Told her that was part of the problem, that she'd trusted impersonal displays over personal testimony, that she'd needed external validation of my reality rather than simply believing what I told her, that the requirement for proof revealed the depth of her skepticism. We talked for another hour. Margaret asked questions about training, about routes, about daily operations. Some of the questions revealed how little she'd actually understood about what I did, how much she'd been filling gaps in knowledge with assumptions rather than asking directly. I answered patiently, explained the progression from flight school through various ratings and positions, described the training requirements and check rides and ongoing evaluation, laid out the reality that had always existed but that she'd never quite believed. At one point, she asked why I'd never pushed back harder, why I'd let her maintain wrong assumptions for so long. I explained that I'd tried initially, that her resistance to believing me had been so strong that continued efforts felt pointless, that eventually I'd just stopped trying to convince her. She acknowledged that she'd been resistant, that she'd had fixed ideas about what was possible and who could do it, that breaking through those ideas apparently required visual evidence from departure boards and seeing other female pilots in the terminal, that my word alone hadn't been sufficient. The admission was honest but also revealing, that I'd needed to prove my reality through external validation, that my credibility had been insufficient without supporting evidence from impersonal sources. That family relationship hadn't created enough trust for her to simply believe what I told her. We drove back to my apartment in silence. Margaret was leaving the next morning, returning to her life with new understanding of mine. She'd seen the departure board, had walked through the terminal, had witnessed the operations I'd been describing for years, had finally accepted that the fantasy was real. That evening, she asked if she could see photos from my travels, the places I'd been flying to for years. I showed her pictures from Tokyo and Paris and Singapore, from London and Hong Kong and Dubai, visual evidence of routes flown, destinations reached, career sustained despite her certainty. It was impossible. She looked at each photo carefully, asking questions about the cities and the flights. Some of her questions revealed assumptions she was still working to discard, expectations about how the world worked that were being challenged by evidence of my actual experience. At one point, she said it still seemed surreal, that a woman from our family was flying internationally as a captain, that this was so far outside her frame of reference. I pointed out that it was only surreal because she'd never expanded her frame of reference, never challenged assumptions about who could do what. Monday morning, I drove Margaret to the airport for her flight home. She thanked me for my patience, for showing her the terminal and the operations, for helping her understand what she should have understood years ago. Said she'd be different at future family gatherings, would correct other relatives who made assumptions. I thanked her for the commitment but said I'd believe it when I saw it, that words were easier than actually changing patterns of assumption and dismissal. She accepted that, said she'd earned the skepticism, that proving change would take time and consistency. At the departure drop-off, she hugged me goodbye and said she was proud of what I'd accomplished, even if she'd failed to recognize it for too long. That the departure board had opened her eyes to reality she should have seen through my own testimony, that she regretted the years of dismissal and doubt. I watched her disappear into the terminal, pulling her suitcase, joining the flow of travelers. Wondered if the apology and realization would stick, if seeing the departure board would create lasting change in how she viewed my career and my credibility, or if old assumptions would gradually reassert themselves. Drove back home and got ready for my next trip. 2 days off, then another international pairing, this time to Frankfurt. The work continued regardless of family dynamics, regardless of who believed or doubted, regardless of whether my aunt finally understood after a decade of dismissal. Weeks passed. Margaret called a few times, asked more questions about flying, seemed genuinely interested in understanding rather than dismissing, mentioned she'd been talking to other family members, explaining that I actually was an international captain, correcting assumptions that had apparently been widespread. My mother called and said Margaret had been very different in recent conversations, had been enthusiastically explaining my career to relatives who'd shared her earlier skepticism, that seeing the departure board had apparently created evangelical convert, someone who now wanted to correct everyone's misconceptions. I was glad but also cautious. Years of dismissal couldn't be erased by a few weeks of enthusiasm. Years of not being believed couldn't be undone by suddenly being believed too enthusiastically. The change was welcome but would need to prove durable before I'd fully trust it. More months passed. Margaret sent articles about aviation, about women pilots, about industry developments. Each one came with notes saying she'd been thinking of me, that she was learning more about my profession, that she was sorry for all the years of not understanding. The sustained effort helped. Not because I needed her validation or approval, but because it represented genuine attempt to understand rather than dismiss, genuine engagement with reality rather than fantasy about what reality should be. The consistency mattered more than the enthusiasm. Eventually, she asked if she could visit again, if she could maybe see me actually fly, understand better what the work entailed. I was uncertain about having family observe, about mixing personal and professional in that way. But the request showed genuine interest rather than skeptical dismissal. Arranged for her to ride the jump seat on a domestic flight, shorter trip to San Francisco and back, chance to see operations without the complexity of international flying. Got approval from the airline, confirmed she met requirements for cockpit observers, scheduled it for a day when I was flying a route she could reasonably travel. Margaret arrived at the airport looking nervous and excited. She'd dressed professionally, brought minimal carry-on, followed my instructions about when and where to meet. I introduced her to my first officer, explained she'd be observing from the jump seat, got her settled in the cockpit. Watching her experience the pre-flight was interesting. She was quiet, attentive, clearly trying to understand what we were doing and why. Asked occasional questions about procedures and instruments, took in everything with focused attention that her previous dismissal had never allowed. When we started engines and began taxiing, I could see her processing the reality of the operation, the weight of the aircraft, the complexity of the systems, the coordination required, the responsibility inherent in commanding this machine. All of it becoming real in ways departure boards couldn't quite convey. The takeoff was smooth. I could sense her tension during the acceleration and rotation, the physical experience of hundreds of tons lifting off the ground under my control, the climb into clear California sky, the routine coordination with air traffic control, the professional operation she'd never quite believed I was capable of. At cruise altitude, we talked briefly during the quiet period. She said she finally understood what I'd been trying to explain for years, that seeing it firsthand made it undeniable in ways descriptions couldn't achieve, that she felt foolish for not believing me, for requiring this level of proof before accepting reality. I told her that most people didn't require proof, that most people accepted their family members' descriptions of their work without demanding visual confirmation, that the need for proof revealed assumptions about my credibility that ran deeper than just skepticism about my specific career. She acknowledged this, said the assumptions had been about gender and possibility more than about me personally, that she'd had fixed ideas about what women could do professionally, that my career had challenged those ideas in ways that made her uncomfortable. That dismissal had been easier than updating her worldview. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now to stay updated on your phone. The approach into San Francisco was in clear weather, visual flying down the bay, the city and bridges visible below. I flew it manually, let Margaret experience the precision of the approach, the small corrections and adjustments, the skill required to put the aircraft exactly where it needed to be. The landing was smooth, touched down gently, rolled out straight, exited at the planned taxiway. The completion of routine operation that I'd executed thousands of times, that Margaret was experiencing for the first time, that proved concrete reality of capabilities she'd dismissed as fantasy. After shutdown, Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said she understood now, really understood, why my frustration with her dismissal had been so deep, that seeing the work made clear how wrong she'd been, how insulting her skepticism must have felt, how exhausting it had been to not be believed. During the turnaround in San Francisco, she asked more questions about training and career progression, about challenges and rewards, about what sustained me through difficulties. The questions were different now, genuinely curious rather than skeptical, seeking understanding rather than confirming assumptions. The return flight to Portland was equally smooth. Margaret was more relaxed now, more comfortable in the jump seat, more able to absorb what she was seeing without the nervousness of the first flight. Asked fewer questions, just observed operations, witnessed the routine competence of professional flying. After landing and parking in Portland, Margaret thanked both me and my first officer for allowing her to observe, said it had been educational in ways she couldn't have anticipated, that it had fundamentally changed her understanding not just of my career, but of her own assumptions and biases. We had dinner that evening, and she talked about what she'd experienced. Not just the flying itself, but the realization of how completely she'd misunderstood my reality, how thoroughly she'd let assumptions override testimony, how much damage that had done over years of dismissal. Asked what had finally convinced her, whether it was seeing the departure board or experiencing the actual flying. She said the departure board had started the process, had created crack in assumptions that made her willing to consider she'd been wrong, but the jump seat experience had completed it, had made undeniable what the board had only suggested. I appreciated the honesty, but also pointed out that I'd been describing both the board and the flying for years, that she'd had access to this information through my testimony long before requiring visual proof, that the need for external validation revealed lack of trust in my credibility. She agreed, said that was the core issue, that she'd needed to confront her own bias about whose testimony deserved belief, that she'd trusted her assumptions over my direct statements, had required objective proof before accepting subjective testimony, had made me work to prove reality that should have been accepted on my word. The conversation was difficult but necessary. Margaret was genuinely grappling with her assumptions and their impacts, genuinely trying to understand how her skepticism had affected our relationship and my experience of family interactions over years. Before she left to return home, she asked if I'd forgive her for the years of dismissal, for the accumulated weight of not being believed, for making me prove reality instead of accepting testimony. I said forgiveness would come with time and changed behavior, that words of apology mattered less than sustained different treatment. She accepted that, said she'd demonstrate change rather than just claiming it, that she'd work to rebuild credibility through consistency rather than promises, that seeing the departure board and experiencing the jump seat had taught her not just about my career, but about her own failures of belief and trust. Years passed. Margaret kept her commitment. At family gatherings, she enthusiastically explained my career to relatives, corrected assumptions, shared what she'd learned from the jump seat experience. Her conversion from skeptic to supporter was genuine and sustained. Her changed understanding reflected in consistent behavior. Other relatives gradually adjusted their understanding too, influenced by Margaret's new perspective and information. The family narrative shifted from me chasing fantasy to me succeeding in demanding career, from skepticism about my descriptions to acceptance of my reality. The change was welcome but also bittersweet. It had required Margaret seeing departure board before believing testimony, required jump seat experience before accepting descriptions, required external validation before trusting family members' direct statements about their own life and work. I continued flying. The career Margaret had dismissed as fantasy remained solid and real. The work she doubted I was capable of became routine in its consistency. International routes, wide-body aircraft, professional operations that proved capability every single flight. The departure board kept displaying flights, kept listing destinations, kept showing operations that were real, regardless of who believed or doubted them. The objective evidence Margaret had needed before trusting my subjective testimony. The impersonal validation that had finally broken through years of dismissal. Sometimes I thought about that moment when she'd first seen the board, when the concrete display of flights had created crack in her certainty that I was chasing fantasy. About how that crack had eventually widened into genuine understanding, had transformed dismissal into engagement, had changed our relationship. The board hadn't changed what I did, hadn't altered my capability, hadn't made my career more or less real. It had only changed what Margaret was willing to believe, had only provided the external proof she'd required before accepting reality I'd been describing all along. That requirement for proof, that need for validation beyond my testimony, revealed something about trust and credibility, and whose voices were believed without verification. Revealed that my word alone hadn't been sufficient, that family relationship hadn't created enough trust to overcome assumptions about who could do what. But the departure board had been sufficient. The jump seat experience had been sufficient. The concrete, observable external validation had accomplished what years of direct testimony couldn't achieve, had made fantasy into reality not by changing anything about the fantasy itself, but by changing what Margaret was willing to see. I kept flying, kept seeing departure boards listing my flights, kept operating routes Margaret had once doubted existed in my capability, kept proving through daily work what had always been true. The fantasy had been hers, not mine. Her fantasy that I was chasing impossibility when I was actually living reality. The board had shown her truth. The jump seat had confirmed it. And eventually, finally, after years of dismissal and doubt, she'd accepted what I'd been telling her from the beginning, that the career was real, the capability was real, the success was real, that the only fantasy had been her assumption that it couldn't be. The departure board kept displaying flights. I kept flying them. And Margaret kept learning that reality existed independent of her belief in it, that my capability didn't require her acknowledgement to be real, that fantasy and reality depended on whose perspective was accurate, not whose assumptions were comfortable. She'd chased the fantasy of believing I couldn't do what I was actually doing. I'd chased the reality of building career she'd been certain was impossible. In the end, the departure board had revealed which of us had been seeing clearly all along. The flights continued. The board kept displaying them. And I kept being exactly what I'd always been. A pilot flying real routes to real destinations, living reality while being accused of chasing fantasy by people who couldn't see past their own assumptions. Margaret had seen the departure board, and everything had changed. Not the reality of what I did, but her willingness to believe it. The fantasy was over. The truth had always been there, displayed on boards in terminals worldwide, operated by capable pilots regardless of who doubted them. I kept flying, the board kept displaying, the fantasy was hers, the reality was mine, and eventually, finally, she'd seen what had always been there to see. The departure board didn't lie. It just showed flights, to real destinations, flown by real pilots, including me, finally believed, finally accepted, finally real in her eyes after years of being real in objective fact. The departure board had spoken. And even Margaret had to listen. The flights continued. So did I.